Okay, so I'm Patrick Jagoda. I'm here at the University of Chicago. I teach in the Cinema Media Studies department and the English department and help run the Western Game Lab here. So I'm going to talk about one project rather than a bunch that I worked on with Ashton Sparrow, who's back there, and a bunch of people at the university. Really high level before I show you some of the actual work through a little documentary that we just got done 2 days ago. So this will be kind of the small world premiere of it, of this project. The Terrarium project was an alternate reality game, which is a form that, had this kind of emergence in around 2001 with The Beast and I Love Bees and a series of those kinds of games, but that I actually increasingly think has more of a life in this moment than it did at that earlier web moment. So these are, just to go over this really briefly, how many of you have played an alternate reality game? I know you have. So these are transmedia games. So I basically think of them as heavily mediated and narrative-driven scavenger hunts that unfold in both physical space and online. They're transmedia rather than multimedia experiences. A multimedia experience I think of as something that happens entirely on one screen where you combine sound, image, video, animation, whatever, but it's largely happening on a single screen like a video game. With these, you're moving across different media, text, video, audio, phone calls, scavenger hunts, email, theatrical performance, and so forth. And so you're living in a single world, sometimes over weeks or even months, and traversing it across different media. The stories are broken up into discrete pieces that players must rediscover or reconfigure. It's like being a protagonist or a collective protagonist in the midst of a novel that's unfolding around you. Third of all, the player networks are don't love that word, but are collective. So these are never single player games. Fourth of all, and this is a really important dimension of these games that distinguishes them from a broader category of pervasive games, is they use this is not a game aesthetic. In other words, you don't tell your players explicitly that they are playing a game. So the negotiation of the status of the thing that they're doing happens in real time and is like imminent to the group that's playing the game itself, rather than being told you're reading a novel, you're watching a film, you're playing a video game. And then last of all, as I already mentioned, these are oftentimes long duration experiences rather than a handful of sittings. These take place over multiple weeks or multiple months. Rarely does a single player experience every element of the world. It's more about creating for the collective rather than creating for the individual. I've worked on a number of alternate reality games since 2011, many of them with Ashlyn, wherever she is. She was here a minute ago. She's right there. Sorry, I saw you back there. You have blue hair, so it should be easier for me from around this point down. I'm just going to focus on the Terrarium project, but a number of these had learning dimensions to them. I wouldn't classify most of them as educational games, but each of them had a concern with pedagogy in a very central way, at different scales and with different topics. So speculation was about as a critique of finance culture. The source was about STEM and getting underrepresented youth into STEM. The parasite was about concepts of diversity and dissensus on campuses. And Terrarium, which I'll talk about now, was about climate change. So part of our thinking a couple of years ago when we started conceptualizing this project was that, climate change has been a huge issue for decades. Like I remember being in high school and studying global warming and climate change in fair detail, but it's really only been the last 2 summers that this has become a media frame, right? Because there are images of like burning forests and things like that that are viscerally, I think, compelling to people in a way that they weren't before. So this is also scarily the first time in 2019 that over 50% of the population count themselves as concerned believers in the phenomenon of climate change. And the numbers in the United States are even better when you look at these categories of, for instance, people who believe global warming is caused by human activities, right? So the kind of Anthropocene argument, or people who believe that most scientists believe global warming is occurring. So, and those numbers are in the 60% range. This last summer in particular, right, this happened long after our initial planning, but very wonderfully, there were climate protests all around the world. Of course, Greta Thunberg and other young people were at the center of many of these protests. So this was kind of in the backdrop of the project that we were working on as we were working on it. As we started to work on an alternate reality game about climate change, which I'll talk about in a moment, that took on a science fiction frame, we were also thinking about other media approaches to climate change. So for instance, films like Snowpiercer, or on the sci-fi end, First Reformed in a much more kind of like high art cinema, and even Parasite, right, which people have done climate change readings of, have been grappling with this issue over the last few years. And then in fiction, we have things like Kim Stanley Robinson's wonderfully non-utopian, non-dystopian account of New York in 2140. That's very much a climate change novel. Here, which is a graphic novel which thinks about deep time. And then various performance art pieces that have grappled with rising sea levels, for instance, and other secondary phenomena of climate change. So these were things that were in the back of our minds, but in all of these cases, they're very representational. It's something that you do over the course of a few hours. It represents climate change in some way, and we wanted players to live with the issues of climate change in a much more visceral way. And so we turned to the alternate reality game. The idea being that we wanted to create an alternate world that people could inhabit over the course of several weeks or months and ask deep questions about a very complicated issue. I'm just going to go over, I'm mostly going to show a couple of videos, one of which I have shown before, another one of which we haven't screened before, but I want to give you a high-level sense of why we did this and for whom we did it. So for the Playerbase, we created this game for the incoming students at the University of Chicago. So we targeted about 1,700, 1,800 students who were coming into the university to produce a kind of way for them to connect before they even came to campus online through a series of online tasks that were all at least loosely tied in to climate change. And I should say that even though I'm the one presenting this, there was a whole group of people who worked on this, and it was one of the most wonderfully interdisciplinary experiences that I've had. So in addition to Ashton, who's a game designer, we had Mark Downey, who's a wonderful interface designer and filmmaker. We had an installation artist, Sandy, who worked on puzzle design, and a bunch of other things. And we included students in all of this as well, both undergraduate and graduate students. The narrative of this game had to do with a connection that was opening from the present in 2019 to the future in 2049. And the basic idea was that a series of students and faculty on this campus were starting to see glitches on their devices that were coming from 2049 allegedly. And when they put those pieces together, they yielded the blueprint for a time communication device, which we actually built in the present and which was built in 2049 as well. The gameplay consisted over 3 different parts. The first one, which we thought of as the rabbit hole, is the onboarding onto this game. Because again, you can't tell people, hey, you're playing a game, and just bring them in. So we had to find kind of clever ways to get them to a central website that would then be the platform or the hub for the remaining gameplay. So that was point number 1. I'll say a little bit about that. Part 2 were 4 different future worlds that began as dystopias but moved into different directions of imagining what different versions of the year 2049 might look like, and those were transmitted over Twitch. We basically created reverse escape rooms where there was someone trapped in a room whom you could access via Twitch, and you had to help them collaboratively get out of that room over the course of many days or many weeks. And then finally, we had this thing called the Futures Design Challenge, which happened on campus once students came here together, and their students got together in teams and pitched their best design idea about how to mitigate or think differently about climate change. This varied from like speculative design projects all the way through like engineering projects and policy projects and stuff like that. Most of this was collaborative. The last piece had a light competitive dimension to it as well. again, I think the video that I'm going to show is going to cover most of this, but the one part that I do want to talk about is the rabbit hole, because people oftentimes ask, like, how do people begin to play a game like this? So what we did, and I'm feeling sheepish because there's actually one person who played the game in the room, so which usually doesn't happen. It was great. So there's an email that goes out to all of the incoming students regularly at the beginning of, in May, basically. It basically says, like, welcome, and is pretty boring in many ways. But the administration allowed us to hide a code in that email and to produce a PS that had nothing here. But if you highlighted this, in fact, there was a message here that said select all. And if you selected all, it said forecast.uchicago.edu/terrarium.pdf. If you type that in, it took you to a syllabus for a course from the year 2021, so a syllabus that could not have yet been implemented. That was a 3-part syllabus about a course called The Ends of Civilization, which was like basically making fun of the University of Chicago's Civilization Corps, but also giving students like an actual kind of like sci-fi plus reading list to think about possible and preferable futures. Each of these syllabi was gamified in a sense, or had a series of puzzles built into it that eventually led to a series of websites. We were able to integrate those puzzles into actual URLs in the University of Chicago web architecture. So we collaborated, which took way too much time, with 15 different humanities departments who had like 1,000 questions about why we wanted to create a /Terrarium page on their page, but finally let us do it. And this was a way of teaching students like what the 15 humanistic disciplines of the university were, right? So they had to find those, and each of those had 1/15 of a puzzle that they then had to sort of solve, and had to figure out why these images in this order. Once they solved all of that, they got to the central website, which became the hub for the remainder of the summer and the remainder of the game. So I'll skip through this stuff. So basically, these are just like, there was a bunch of, so there was like GroupMe stuff, there was Facebook Messenger stuff, there was a Discord that they started and maintained through the majority of the summer. There ended up being a lot of speculative design projects that students themselves created in response to prompts over the summer, which is fantastic. So this was like a crowdsourced like art class that wasn't, an art class, and this was like a fraction of the whole alternate reality game. The other thing that we did, which was really exciting in the specific context of a university, was, we thought to ourselves, there are countless problems with orientation. It's boring. It's basically like a bunch of boring people talking to 1,800 people at lectures that they then forget, and we did research on this, they then forget largely 2 to 3 weeks later. I'm sure you remember, Nora, but other people that we talked to had already forgotten 3 weeks later as to what it is that they learned during orientation, allegedly. And we found faculty weren't very involved. And so especially for first-generation students, whom we were very focused on here, we found that they were less likely in their first year to go and talk to professors, to ask for extensions, to do a lot of the things that privileged students coming from like private schools and stuff like that are oftentimes feel very comfortable doing. And so we also wanted to like push more faculty into a kind of accessible, presentable place. And we got 30 plus faculty to create a video that I'll show you only a fraction of, where they're basically reporting on receiving these communications from the year 2049. And I'll show you a little bit of that. There are also puzzles built into the video itself. So the video is gamified. It has Morse code that you'll hear at different moments. There are also images that you would have to stop the video for in order to solve subsequent puzzles. So it's a layered kind of experience. Okay. And it was meant to be a leaked video, so it's undone, unfinished.
From my house and realized that something was wrong with my podcast player.
The messages come in a scrambled but intriguingly scrambled way.
You'd think that somebody you knew was writing to you, or you think maybe it's a little spam, but it's the weirdest text.
The quantum botanist, xenoprogrammer.
The interruptions that almost sounded like old-fashioned, I don't know, like back in the days of like radio when you would turn the dial.
One day I found one image that seemed to be part of a blueprint.
They have numbers and charts and things.
Maybe there's some kind of, consciousness arising.
Some group that I hadn't heard of sent me an email with an ice core that was showing the years 2050.
This sounds exactly like the plot of Contact.
When you believe that the future is communicating with you, that's kind of like saying you believe that angels are talking to you.
As a historian, the only parallel I can think through, strange things happened in British India in 1857, when people suddenly noticed chapatis, the leavened flat Indian bread. Suddenly chapatis appeared in villages and got transferred from one village to another. And people didn't understand why the chapatis were appearing. And it itself created an atmosphere of anxiety, some fear, but also of anticipation.
Well, it could be they're coming to Chicago because Chicago has always liked to talk about itself with what I would call a rhetoric of, this is the professional historian in me, not the local cheerleader or marketeer. It's uncanny the way in which the university has claimed for itself what I would call a special mission in American higher education. Okay. You may end up in understanding things and learning about things that are even more frightening than what you thought when you began your intellectual journey.
So when I started getting these messages about the terrarium, I looked the word up.
It's a glass bubble or a glass tank in which you grow things.
A plant in a glass globe, it should be, I don't know, I feel that should have a positive effect, but for me it's weirdly menacing.
Small, confined, and intentional spaces.
We can run an experiment in a terrarium, and the risks are lower.
The first use of the word terrarium comes in 1880.
Based on the model of aquarium.
The word Terra, and that's our planet. And so, sounds like a planet in a bottle. Maybe a place to hide.
People could be safe and actually grow food and have breathable air and access to water, but everybody's not gonna have it.
I don't hear the word terrarium, I hear the word terror and aria. And it sounds to me like this is a song of grave warning.
The best terrarium would be that which is not a terrarium, in which there are no boundaries.
Perhaps if Terrarium is a computer simulator.
It sounds like the Truman Show, right?
I wonder why this word is popping up, who constructed it, what is inside.
There's some other universe within the time slip that is carefully, one hopes carefully, continuing to cultivate us within the terrarium.
Everybody is living within bubbles of some kind that they've created in order to survive the climate change that's coming.
We'll stop there. It goes on for another 12 minutes, and there's climate change specific stuff that emerges from it. But a lot of it is
walking to.
A lot of it is also producing different frames for thinking about science fiction, but not science fiction as something you would read or watch, but something that you would live, right? Like an alternative mode of life that again can be immanent and produced together through a collective. Okay, so usually, or the last couple of times when I presented on this project, I would go through the whole thing, but as I was saying a couple of days ago, we finished a documentary, very short documentary about it. So I thought that this would be the perfect opportunity to screen it and then talk about it and take any of your questions. I might gloss a couple of things about the documentary afterwards, but I think that this will cover a lot of the why and the what of what we did, and also show you some cool footage from the experience itself. It also includes student voices, player voices, and creator voices. Yeah, so I will just start that and move out of the way.
I'm a UChicago student. I heard that you guys were collecting evidence of strange things happening.
It was a really weird, lucid daytime dream?
All of the dates were populating to...
The message was from 2049.
They were really adamant that the sea level would rise.
Don't go in the water.
It's called an alternate reality game.
You may end up in understanding things and learning about things that are even more frightening than what you thought when you began your intellectual journey.
It's a heavier level of the way stories work.
So my first reaction was, this is the most UChicago thing to do.
It's something that no one has ever seen before.
You have this jumbled mess and you have to make sense of what it is, knowing that you have an ultimatum in mind.
And I thought it would just end up being a small handful of puzzles, but it was something that led to something much bigger.
The story of Terrarium is the future has gone very badly wrong. Global warming,
totalitarianism,
climate change.
In the present, you can always keep distancing the future and saying, that's not going to be my generation, and that's not going to be something that I'm personally contributing to. But we are.
Will we protect the environment? Will we prevent dictatorships from coming into power?
How it would feel to live 30 years in the future.
It was exhilarating and terrifying to have that knowledge, to see how the world will be, and to know that your actions have to change that.
20 seconds, okay. Okay, we got that.
Terrarium is an alternate reality game
that we're creating for incoming students at the University of Chicago. We really wanted to create a world that convinced students that they were communicating with the year 2049.
A group of faculty members built a device. As a result, the world of 2049 shifted.
Because science fiction defamiliarizes people to their present and helps them think more effectively. And alternate reality games use what's called this is not a game aesthetic.
You have to design bigger than what the players can imagine.
Everything from
online documents,
design challenge,
emails,
puzzles,
student videos.
There's a course called The Ends of Civilization,
faculty videos,
reverse escape room.
We created this lab, a logo, and a uniform.
The faculty had a blast wearing blue lab coats and playing the role of characters who were interacting with the year 2049. Terrarium is a contribution to serious games research, experimenting with contemporary online platforms. There's an email that goes from the university to every incoming student in the first year at the University of Chicago. We worked with an amazing puzzle designer, Sandy Weiss, to incorporate a puzzle into that email.
The first day that the letter came out,
I was on a group chat on Facebook, and someone mentioned this cryptic message.
And it led me to a syllabus.
We created a series of fake syllabi from the year 2021 and then hid puzzles within them. So students were at once getting a reading list of things about climate change, but they were also solving these puzzles together.
And I ended up going through these puzzles until someone on the Facebook posted, I'm stuck, and it was somewhere way beyond where I'd gotten. I'm like, wow, this is a really smart group of people.
We designed the puzzles to be collaborative. We didn't want this to be competitive. We didn't want this to be individualistic. We really wanted to create a cooperative.
I had helped set up the beginnings of what became our Google Doc. This is the history of what happened and how people got to this step. The new puzzle was released. I solved it and I posted it, and then I was placed into the history document.
I discovered that there were all these brilliant people solving all these really cool puzzles.
It's kind of like a frenzy, but at the same time, it's a really interesting bonding experience.
It was an absolute mess, but also a delight.
Students were so interested in the puzzle solving, and as a designer, that's incredibly exciting because your players are getting ahead of you, and you have to work harder in order to keep up.
We were communicating around the world.
There was a ton of different puzzles. The method of solving was cryptic. There would be a link on a specific web page and then just a list of clues that would be apparently random. And you'd have to figure out what that meant. Like, the puzzle was not the hard part. The hard part was, what does this mean?
Every time you play test a puzzle, you get a better sense of what the players might like and what might be so overwhelming that they just shut down.
It was responsive.
A lot of human-centered design.
Our most successful puzzles could be solved in about 24, maybe 36 hours. It needs to be hard enough that you feel satisfied in solving it, but it should never make you feel stupid.
There was one that really got us stuck. The bullet points were different shades. Then someone connected the shading of the bullet points to a board game. I think it was Mastermind or something. And I was like, this is like absolutely insane. How could anyone possibly think of that? So at that point, I was pretty sucked into the experience.
In 2017, we staged The Parasite, our first alternate reality game as part of orientation. Terrarium built on the successes that we had with The Parasite, inviting students into the university.
And it also got harder when it went to the live stream.
Are you there? I can't see you.
We would get a message about when a stream would be appearing, and it was a stream from 2049, so 30 years in the future.
So that was weird.
Part of our research had to do with the kinds of media and platforms that 17 and 18-year-olds are likely to use. Twitch is a live streaming platform.
It's very exciting as a designer. It's a new technology that we're not really sure what to do with it yet, especially as a place for faculty research, bringing together people to kind of think and engineer.
Players were interacting in real time with a live actor who could improvise and change the world and the narrative in response to what they were doing. That's something you can't do in a video game.
So basically, each live stream was set in a different version of a future 2049.
I'm the anchor.
Each of the 4 worlds had to be realistic, but really they had to be interactive, so that we were able to do anything that a player asked or was interested in.
We were thinking about contemporary escape rooms. We were thinking about older artistic collectives like Fluxus and the Situationist.
The first one was Patrick Jagoda, who had been trapped in a room, and we had to solve these puzzles to get locks open so he could get 4 items out of these bags. So people would work together trying to puzzle out. We were given like a symbol as a clue, and then we had to figure out what in the room corresponded to that symbol and then figure out how to crack that code.
And it was very glitchy because obviously it's from 2049, the signal's not the best. So it was kind of a mad rush. There was a set time for each stream, so we had to like milk all of the information out of it before the stream ended.
I don't understand this, Terry. This is so...
We really moved over into this other world and tried to live by its rules. This is like, you know, there's this real issue of bleed in thinking about live action role-playing games. The way that people's personalities move into their characters and the way their characters move back into their everyday personalities.
And the next live stream was with someone who was communicating with us telepathically. And so their messages would show up on the screen and we have to read them and communicate back. We had to tell this person how to move their body in order to unlock things.
For each world, we had a single room and a single character who would convey through their costume, through objects in the room, what had happened 30 years into the future. Designing the world, the set, the costumes led us to revise the narrative and the characters. We reached out and found a really fantastic sound designer.
What I'm trying to do is create a little of the dystopian world. In game playing, you have to be rewarded if you solve a piece of that puzzle. There's always an event, an oral event that says, okay.
What does your present in 2019 owe to 2049?
The third one, they'd ask moral questions. And then at the end of it, something terrible would happen. There was a weird tree with a bunch of water, and they'd do a weird ritual. Then we watched those frames very carefully because they uploaded it afterward. So I'd like go through frame by frame and see what happened. All the rituals involved putting a book into the wall. It'd be a different book every time. I didn't know if it meant anything, but I had to like pause the frame and see like, here's like the first very blurry half of this title. Here's the second very blurry half of this title. What's the title of the book? And then the fourth one, I think, was a game show.
Please step forward, contestant 4. Question 2. What do you think you would bring to the position of being anchor?
I think that bugs should be allowed to vote. I think that all
The fourth one was what was really interesting. There had been like extreme overpopulation, and so it was a game show to see who would be the anchor that would connect to the Terry device. We were talking and we were like, why should we have to choose one person? Why can't we just choose not to choose? And I think it broke the game.
It allowed us to think about how one might broadcast around the globe and get live feedback and work with lighting, sound, and video elements.
Figuring out with all the designers how to make the process come together in a sort of cohesive look.
The bunker was a lot of fun to sort of come up with the world and think about what the possibilities of communication might have been, to merge completely organic and completely digital technologies into something really beautiful.
We had 24 hours between episodes to write and produce and air.
There definitely has been a time when I've been watching the stream and going, you know what, this is a new form of art. We made it, we touched it.
We're inviting you to join the Futures Design Challenge.
$5,000 is going around.
The Futures Design Challenge was a contest that invited students to form teams and to compete with the best idea that they had for how they could combat climate change.
You formed a team and you had to come up with a solution to climate change, a part of it, or the whole thing. There was a bunch of different ways to win.
I joined a Future Design Challenge team. It was Singaporean students, one French student, and me. There was a lot of arguing about what exactly we would make, but we ended up making an app that aims to reduce household electricity consumption. There was also the element of the climate quest.
So every time you complete a climate quest, you'll receive points.
So when we started working on Terrarium, we had just opened the Weston Game Lab and the Media Arts Data and Design Center, and a series of undergraduate interns came into this space on a daily basis and worked on climate quests. The climate quests gave students a chance to get their hands dirty and design some games that the incoming students could play.
In this climate quest, we're going to be taking a place and fast forward it into the future.
The climate quest really showed that tackling climate change is going to be an interdisciplinary issue.
We really thought about it as like a live action role-playing game. When you think of something like Call of Duty, you can easily tell what a game designer values. They really value how many other players that you shoot. And that's actually how we came up with this scoring system called CRISP, which stands for Collaboration, Research, Inquiry, Service, and Presentation.
Which are 5 skills that we think will be vital in addressing climate change.
You'll receive points in one or more of these 5 categories that'll go on your team's CRISP radar.
Going into the competition, you basically had to pitch your project.
And then present it to a panel of judges.
Preliminary round, where multiple groups presented.
Electricity consumption data is fed into the app through our houses.
Most of them were STEM-based.
This process requires negotiation.
19 actually did art. You begin at the very top at action or not, and then you would make a choice.
Running the Future Design Challenge was incredibly exciting.
Orientation at a university can cover a lot of ground, but oftentimes faculty aren't intimately interconnected with what's going on. And so we wanted to invite faculty judges to see these wonderful presentations by incoming students, to give them feedback, but also to form working relationships with them from day one.
The faculty learned as much from each other as the players did. Everybody came out of the Future Design Challenge changed.
We made it to the final round. It was awful, it was nerve-wracking.
Together we make up Albiotical.
Sometimes there is a micro solution to a macro problem.
We also plan on making as many aspects of the operation eco-friendly as possible.
We can save our world!
So now, let's formally introduce Nudged, which is a self-designed, self-coded app.
Judging process was impossible.
There were so many projects that were worthy of being signaled out.
We won both the most likely to go viral, and we also won the Climate Quest Award.
With an alternate reality game, you don't have that distinction between the real and the fictional. We really wanted to experiment with what another form of community might be like. as important as doing this at the University of Chicago was, we'd also like to create a game that could be replicated at other universities or other institutions.
Alternate reality games are us trying to iterate, but also trying to train a generation to really be able to think and to engineer.
They aren't high school students anymore. They're not quite college students yet. So it's this liminal space in which they're figuring out who they are and who they want to be.
That openness allows for a time of change.
And so we think it's a really powerful moment to seed ideas and ambitions so they can spend the 4 years not just taking their courses and being defensive, but also imagining how the world could be a better place.
When I first received the email and the clue, I was really excited. I was like, I came to the right university. They're doing these like cool puzzle things that no other universities are doing.
And just seeing how excited all of these people were about learning and discovering things this way. It was a really great way to like give me a community over the summer.
It helped me make friends by setting me up to make friends.
It was both engaging and scary to communicate with the future.
It induces a lot of paradoxes that still make me very uncomfortable, but it's also like invigorating.
To see the impact that our actions have.
Knowing that someone constructed this so cleverly that you can piece it together in like a meaningful, beautiful way.
Your choices matter, and it is the actions that you make and the science that you do and what you do that cause this to happen. We give you this knowledge. What are you going to do about it?
At this point, going to stop the presentation part because I think the questions that you might have or comments might be more interesting than whatever else I have to say about the game, and I think that at least gave us a car to talk about it. Yeah, I mean, most of this was already covered. Let me see if there's anything. Yeah, I mean, I'll stop there. I mean, just to summarize, I guess, like we thought of this as a transmedia project, an interdisciplinary project to try to intervene within climate change. We were working within the context that we had. So rather than calling out to like some general public, which one never gets, right? With a lot of alternate reality games, you get very specialized players who have played other alternate reality games. We wanted to create a community within, you know, a fairly large space, but not so large that we had to live in going forward, and it yielded this game. So I'll stop now. Happy to answer any questions. Yeah.
Wondering about engagement in the game, that it felt straight. I imagine that there were challenges that were very difficult and people could drop out. Did you re-engage?
Yep.
It was mentioned that there was like an incentive and a challenge part in terms of the prize.
Yep.
How do you come up to that decision? Did it have an effect in participation?
Yep. These are all great questions. Yeah. So when we design alternate reality games, we assume that no single person is going to play the whole thing. Like either they don't discover it early enough, they're not interested in every part of it, so we very purposefully segmented it off into 3 different sections. The first section being the kind of rabbit hole, which is a bunch of online puzzles. The second part being the kind of Twitch-based interactive challenge that you saw a lot of footage of. And the third part was this more kind of conventional design challenge, which was a little bit more competitive. Every other ARG that I've worked on has not had a competitive dimension, but we realized that we were losing certain kinds of players and not having some space for playful competition. So for instance, the last game that we did before this, we attracted a lot of first-generation students, a lot of international students, didn't get as many people who were like destined to be economics majors or stuff like that, right? There's a kind of student that's just like wired toward or prefers certain modes of competition. So we decided, let's be experimental about it, and let's not use heavy gamification, which is bullshit and doesn't work very well, but let's use like little bits and pieces of an incentive structure and see maybe that'll invite a different kind of group in. And in fact, I think it did invite people from the sciences and social sciences who the first time around didn't participate as avidly. I mean, just to give you some of the numbers, these are not like updated in total. This just gives you a sense of like what some of the participation was like. So the first time when we had it announced that this was a game, just via the email that you saw, there were 679 participants that we counted who interacted with that early part of it. Twitch had about 1,800 views. Let me see, I guess we don't have numbers here for the number of, how many people signed up initially, Ashlyn, for the Futures Design Challenge? Do you remember?
We had probably about 200 some students,
yeah.
In teams of like 35-ish. Yeah.
And part of the experiment with Twitch and also with the Futures Design Challenge was thinking, in our contemporary media environment, not everybody wants to be a player, right? Like plenty of people want to watch or have a kind of like secondary relationship, either online or in person. So those two pieces also invited people to come in and be an audience, even if they weren't counted here. And that did, in fact, happen in both contexts. Yeah.
So for context, out of how many incoming students is this really, what percentage?
1,700 students total. The first time that we ran this game, I don't remember the online numbers. There was at least, we didn't count like merely like a hit to a website. People had to do some substantial thing. We got about half of the class, and the game was absolutely not mandatory, right? So that time we got about 900 out of 1,800, and when we did live events on campus, which we did a lot more of in 2017 than we did in 2019, there were events, like the smallest events would have like 30-something people, the biggest events would have 300-something people, which was like enough to create a nice, playful atmosphere, and especially because people weren't going to all the same events, they would then tell one another about things that they had experienced. So this thing really had the feeling of a world, not just like a single narrative or a single event, right? Something that goes on even if you're not there. Yeah, so, and again, it's hard to count because like early on, this was about probably like, 35–40% of the class or whatever. And for this, there were, the couple hundred who signed up for the Futures Design Challenge, but then there were also people who came and watched as an audience. There were people who watched the videos later after the game was done. So yeah, it's variable. Yeah.
I think this is really brilliant. I love the collaboration, getting all the different departments involved as well, and the different layers of participation, potential participation. A few years ago, I came to hear Kim Stanley Robinson speak here, and I wondered if he was aware of this, because it seems like a very interesting.
I was there too, so we probably intersected at the library. Yeah. He wasn't, but it was interesting because, like, in that talk, like I remember, he wasn't negative about the prospect of fighting climate change, but he was like interestingly pessimistic about what it is that fiction could do relative to like behavior change and stuff like that, right?
Although he did talk about being on think tanks through his fiction work, right?
Totally.
So, yeah.
Yeah, so there were these secondary benefits, but the act of reading a novel itself, right? Like, he wasn't negative about it, but he was like sober about what it is that could accomplish in 2020. And it was interesting because the entire time that he was speaking, like I was thinking about this form and thinking about like, well, this gives you affordances that the novel or like a 2-hour film or something doesn't.
Exactly.
So I think that's exactly right. But the first part of what you said too, like, oftentimes when we think about participation, we think about like number of players, but there's another dimension to this that I love, which is that you have these design interns. And so we had about like 14 high school undergraduate and graduate students who participated in the making of this. And when we've done this in the past, like almost all of them go on to like really good PhD programs or take like interesting industry jobs where they're building on this stuff. The other thing is, like, unlike when we did this in 2017, we had like 30-something faculty. So there were conversations between like a faculty member of the humanities who's working on like 19th century fiction and climate change, with someone in the arts who's making videos about climate change, with someone in the sciences who's actually looking at like geophysical science data. And they were all in the same room for months, which was just like, that to me felt like a win in itself.
You've spoken a lot about consequences for, or positive effects for the students, for the participants. I was wondering if this sparked any curiosity in staff and administrators about perhaps in the near future rearranging the departments in the Department of Climate Change, or missions, not majors, and make the professors move between each department, not the students move between each department.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting thought. It's a difficult thing institutionally, I think, to like commit to structures that will persist for long enough to be useful in that way. Like, I think that there are like other mid-level solutions where it's not like a series of one-off courses or an entire major, but something where you have like clusters of courses across departments, which is something we actually did institute. So I'm teaching like a climate change and media design course where we're making speculative design projects right now. But a lot of those students are also moving into like science courses that are related to this. So de facto, that kind of thing has happened. I think it could be a little bit more effectively institutionalized than what we did now. But our hope is to do not this story, not this game, but like every year, like my big pitch to the university was like other schools have like shared books that everybody reads. I mean, students don't really, but like they're supposed to. Like, why don't we not have a shared book? Why don't we have a shared game every year on a different topic? Maybe one year it's AI policy and how artificial intelligence are affecting like every discipline and every part of life. Maybe another year it's like the future of democracy, right? Maybe we do climate change again because it's not going away. But I do like that idea of like, how do you take something that's an ephemeral game and translate it into like a lasting culture or community or even an institutional foundation? Yes?
So when you talk about trying to convince the administration you should get to do one of these every year, how much like labor is involved? Like, is this like your research life for the year, setting it up, or is it something where people can participate without completely destroying their work-life balance while still creating something that's actually cool and worthwhile and has the breadth and depth that you're talking about it having?
I mean, it like wrecks you. I mean, you can talk about it.
I would say like by working at university, I've never had a summer to myself. But I'm not upset by that. Like I personally am always very excited about these new projects where I'm like, sure, fine, whatever. And we've been running these since like 2013. So it is hard, right? It is a hard push, but also no one is forcing anyone to do this, right? We are, and also when we work directly, specifically with students, right? Like Patrick and I or some of our high-level team, like we'll spend hours and hours on this, which is our choice. But for our students in the product and the game portion of this, they're working like standard work hours, right? We make sure that I actually kick people out. They get 2 weeks worth of vacation, right? Like it's so like we make sure it's like a humane environment for people to work in.
So I guess what I'm more curious about is, like you said, you have 30 faculty involved. If you guys are doing like this full intense work, are they all doing that, or some of them?
That's like impossible. So like I basically.
Yeah, that's what I'm sort of.
So like we're constantly looking for people who are crazy to come work with us, basically. No, seriously. I mean, because this is about building a world. This isn't like some like every time we do it, like we go all in for 5 months, and it's like the 24/7 thing, right? Because if the students like misrecognize the narrative, which is such an amazing creative moment, and they think like A equals B, then A equals B, and you like rewrite everything that you've had. So we've had moments where like we've had to throw an entire script out the window and improvise back and like write new kinds of structures. I do think, I mean, to more seriously answer your question, we are looking for ways to integrate these projects into our new media arts and design, currently minor, that we're trying to turn into a major. And if it becomes a major, I think, which I think is likely, there's a real opportunity to build this kind of summer work for the students into their studies. And I think that would also, in the long, I mean, because we probably can't do this every year, like us and Heidi and Kristen, it would maybe spread out their work a little bit. I mean, I did appreciate the faculty members that some of them would come in and be judges or run workshops or do just a little bit more than brainstorm. But it's really, like, basically for those of us who had research deadlines and stuff, like, we'd basically be doing this by day and then you would work on your book at night or whatever, right? Or the article that you have due or something like that. But largely, it does shut down about half of your year. But it's also like 100 different projects, right? It's not just one, so it's kind of worth it. Yeah.
I'm just wondering if it ever occurred to you guys, like in the process of making this, that you guys like the idea of just making like as Terrarium as like a visual art mobile game itself for the students to just also explore, I guess in terms of that sense, because I feel like that's I feel like it's also like a very popular like game genre that's like really popular. So.
Yeah, I mean we thought about, so actually on a previous game that we worked on, Seed, we had an online scavenger hunt that was like iPad based, and so teams would like use their iPads and go to different sites, and once you got to a site, it would trigger a series of site-specific puzzles. And that worked pretty well once people were already on campus. So for this, like, we didn't yet have students on campus for like 80% or 90% of the duration of this game, so couldn't quite do that, right? If there's like people in like Delhi and Beijing and Cleveland, right, it becomes a little bit, I mean, sure, you can do like a Pokemon Go version of Terrarium, and I think if we had the right kind of team, that would be an interesting experiment. There are still limitations to like augmented reality technologies, and so we're oftentimes thinking like with our limited resources, what are the best uses of our time? And oftentimes the answer isn't technology. Like we use technology like a lot of existing platforms and try to really mess with those platforms in interesting ways. But we historically, I think, haven't had the kinds of teams that have allowed us to go down something like the AR or the mobile path. But if we did, totally. Yeah, I mean, we've done a little bit of AR. Yeah.
I'm just curious about what things the students learned. Like, I have this feeling that it was across the stages a hard motivation of this urgent matter of doing something. Mm-hmm. But I was wondering if it was also like science facts or some like more written knowledge to get them motivated and getting them to know something new, so they can make something in their final projects.
Yeah. I mean, I generally don't find facts that interesting as a way of like teaching. Like when, at the moment that you have access to like Wikipedia and online resources, it's more important to know how to use those resources than to have like facts at your fingertips. I mean, memorizing some stuff is helpful, but to a degree. I think we had a mix. So there were like some climate quests, for instance, that required like being able to read climate models. There was the third world that involved like a quiz where there were like 50 questions that were just like thrown at the players rapid fire about like the past and future of climate change that involved like numbers and like, you know, like facts of that sort. But we were also really interested in, I guess, like transferable skills or something, which is a term I hate, but whatever, communicate something. Stuff like the ability to collaborate effectively with other people, the ability to give a convincing presentation and pitch that where you're just not just mumbling to yourself, but where you can like really, because having a good idea, whatever, that's semi-useful, but like selling that idea and getting other people to buy into it, that can sometimes be the hard part. And there are times that some of our students struggle with that sometimes, and so we wanted from day one to put them in a situation where they were thinking about how to present, not just what to present. So those are just some examples. It was everything from, I think, like science information, humanistic knowledge tied to sci-fi short stories or something, and then kind of these transferable skills.
Have you considered perhaps like a review of what had happened? Like say something as simple as like a video that explains how certain people got to certain clues. Maybe some people viewing it might not have seen or understood completely how those puzzles might have been solved. Like, has that been considered?
So there are two sets of things there. One is like doing that while a game is happening. The second is after the game is finished. So while the game is happening, like the players did that. I mean, it was like there was like a beautifully indexed Google Doc that took you to the exact step-by-step history of how every puzzle was solved and what the solution was that was accessible to all of them. But maybe the other part of what you're getting at is something like a post-mortem, which game designers often do, like once you're done with the game, to be able to communicate the details of it. You know, this video was, and other videos that we've created for some of these other games have been attempts, and articles. I mean, we've written articles about each of these games, some of which, like with Steve, we have an article that really gets at the design principles of like how we were thinking about experience design and interaction among the players. But I don't know that we've ever done anything, like we always have like a 100-page game design document, but like keeping track of every single thing that happens while you're deploying a game for 5 months is almost impossible. I mean, it's maybe possible if you have like twice the size of team that we have. But the cool thing that Ashlyn and a few other people did is they maintained a website, which in a way was an archive of a lot of those details. Not all of them, but more of them than I think we've ever recorded. I mean, there were all of the videos of the Twitch sessions were all saved and summarized and searchable, and in fact even have summaries of the puzzle sequences written down, which one of our graduate students did a fantastic job of.
And is that available?
It is. It's
Great. ForTaskLab, spelled F-O-U-R, tasklab.com. Great.
Yeah, it's all organized. I'll probably keep that site for future games. Any other questions? We have like 2 minutes. One more question under that. Yeah. Thank you very much.